Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad. I am the director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program. We'd like it to be a center maybe soon at George Mason University. And this is the MEIS podcast. This is probably the 13th edition, as we've had quite a few of these podcasts featuring our faculty, as well as hosting guest lectures and panelists in various webinars and what have you. We will also be speaking with administrators at George Mason University connected to our program, as well as our student and alumni. Today, I'm very excited to have with me to actually address a number of topics that have to do with their research and teaching. My dear friend Agnieszka Paczynska, as well as Benjamin Gatling, who is also a program faculty at the Middle East and Islamic Studies program. Hi, everyone. How are you?
Great.
Yeah. Good,
Great.
thank you.
Great to see you.
Thank you. Great to see you. Agnieszka, I have not seen you live for quite some time, even before the pandemic. So we can't use that as an excuse.
No, it's
Um,
true.
but we hope things will come back to normal soon. And Ben, it's great to connect with you. I have seen you on Zoom meetings, but I'm very happy that we're doing this. And I'm here to ask you very simply to address the audience. It's our GMU community and broader Middle East studies community to address your research and your teaching. So let me start with Agnieszka and ask you to share with us uh, a few words on your research trajectory, your what you're working on, and what you are uh, likely to be working on in the future as well, so that people kind of learn
Mhm.
more about your work and follow your work.
Great. Thanks so much, Bassam. I've had a number of research projects, two of which the phase one of those projects has been completed. One of them was with Susan Hirsch, project on pedagogy, specifically pedagogy in peace and conflict studies field, um, looking specifically at the role of experiential learning and to what extent experiential learning approaches can facilitate student learning, especially of sort of complex theoretical problems. And we did quite a few experiments, studies, surveys as we were developing these different experiential learning activities, as well as field-based courses. So some of them were for use in the classroom, others were particular types of experiential field-based courses where we partnered with local organizations and students worked on issues of peace building, conflict resolution, and so forth. And that it resulted in a book that just came out, I guess, 2019. So my sense of time because of the pandemic is completely warped. And was called Conflict Zone, Comfort Zone, and looked specifically at field-based courses in conflict zones, both in the United States and across the globe. The second big project that I've been working on has been on the role of new or emerging or rising donors. There's a lot of controversy about what we want to call them in their activities in conflict-affected states. So the way they approach mediation, the way they approach peace building. And this was a collaborative multi-year project that resulted in a book that also came out recently on new donors and their activities in conflict-affected states. And this project is actually ongoing. I just published a couple of days ago sort of a follow-up article on how, in particular, India and China, but also Brazil and Turkey, how their approaches have been changing as they become more involved in conflict-affected states, both in terms of, for instance, investments, right, and trading relationships, and how various norms of non-interference really begin to shift as these states become more engaged. So we see, for instance, China becoming much more engaged in conflict mediation, both in the Middle East and in Africa. So this is a project that will continue. I'm also working on a project on fragile states and how, or states that are labeled as fragile by the international development community, and how they exercise their agency within these policy debates. And why is it that some of them embrace the term fragile state and others do not, right? And how that facilitates their ability to access funding, development funding, but also how these different choices are shaped by their particular political histories.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka, for this really quick and insightful summary. Let me move on to Ben, if you can share with us a few words about your research and or publications and the trajectory.
Great. No, thank you, Bassam. I'm a folklorist. So, for those who may not be familiar about what academic folklore studies is, what folklore studies, we're interested in kind of everyday, creative, expressive ways that people communicate. We're interested in how they use those things to conduct their affairs. We're interested in how they use those things maybe to construct their identities. Just how they use those things to construct their world. So that can be things like stories, but it can also be things like beliefs. It can be rituals people perform. It can be certain kind of material practices like festivals, parades, maybe embodied practices even, things like costume, dress, body art, and the like. Most of my work has been in Persian-speaking Central Asia. The vast majority of my work has been in Tajikistan and to a lesser extent Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. My most recent book published a few years ago was about Sufi groups in Tajikistan. And what I was interested in that project was I was interested in thinking about how Sufis in Tajikistan in the present are using memories, are using stories, are using rituals and comportment, adab, using those types of things directly to contravene the ways that they're experiencing repression from the authoritarian Tajik state. For those who may not be familiar with Tajikistan, Tajikistan is ruled by a president for life, Imam Ali Rahman, who has ruled since the end of their civil war in 1997. And the Tajik state is brutally repressive of religious groups, specifically those religious groups that operate outside of their direct control. So I was interested in this book and how Sufi groups are kind of reacting to that political environment and how they're using expressive forms, right, in ways to express their agency. My more recent work, the work that I'm working on right now, has been with refugees and migrants from Afghanistan who have resettled here in the DC area. Most of my collaborators are SIV recipients. So that's the special immigrant visa that's given to translators, guards, and other individuals that worked collaborating with coalition forces in Afghanistan and have now resettled here, right, in the US. And what I'm doing is I'm working with a few collaborators to document their stories of displacement from Afghanistan and their stories of settlement here, right, in the Northern Virginia, DC area. Our kind of longer term goal of one of our longer term goals is to preserve these stories, right, as a community resource for people. As a folklorist, I'm also, of course, interested in how these stories are told, and I'm interested in kind of the social work of these stories, what their functions, what they do for those individuals who have been displaced.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
We
thank you very
can.
much, Ben. This is really fascinating, and I am glad we're doing this not just in order to showcase our faculty to the GMU community and beyond, but also because I am beginning to learn even more than the basic bios, the biographies that will be made available, by the way, when these podcasts are published after the live session, as well as images of your books and so on that will also be on our upcoming brochures. So at the MEIS program, can you share with me, Agnieszka, a few notes on the courses you teach and anything about your teaching methodology, and how has the current moment with the movement for social justice, for racial justice, and so on, not something that we haven't been thinking about for decades, maybe, but this is becoming so conventional that it usually has, from my previous interviews, affected the way people and educators teach the classes. So if you can tell us about this, and then I'll move on to Ben.
Great, thank you. Well, it's interesting because quite a bit of my sort of teaching has been connected to one of the research, my research agendas, which is pedagogy. And so one of the things I forgot to mention, one of the things I'm working on now, again with Susan Hirsch, is a book on teaching peace and conflict studies. And so a lot of the work I do in the classroom is finding its way into this research project and this book project that is coming up. How has it affected? So what do I teach? So right now, actually, for the second time, I'm teaching a summer course with Leslie Dwyer on COVID-19 conflict and resilience. And we started that, taught it for the first time last summer. So it was an interesting moment to really engage with the pandemic. And of course, the social justice movement that really, as we were teaching the course, it really was quite intense, especially in the DC region, the number of protests, demonstrations, and so on. And so in many ways, it was it became part of our discussions. This was obviously on a virtual class, online class. And because we were looking at issues of conflict, in many ways, it helped students bringing in their, the experiences of the social justice movement that was on, everybody's TV screens, in the newspapers, on the news, into the classroom. And it helped to, I think, for a lot of students, it made it easier to really grapple with some of these theoretical concepts, such as structural violence. What does that mean, right? Because, of course, the pandemic further amplified a lot of the structural inequalities, the structural violence. We could see that different communities were affected by the pandemic in very different ways, right? That the mortality rates in African American communities or Native American communities were much higher than in Caucasian communities, for example, right? The other course I teach, I've been teaching for quite a number of years, is a foundations course for our incoming master's students at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. It's an intense 6-credit course, and one of the things I've done during the pandemic is to shift it, of course, to a virtual format. What's been really interesting is that it really pushed me to develop and think through how to develop a lot of these and adapt these experiential learning activities that I've been using for a long time into a virtual environment, right? How can we, and so that's actually been, again, this connection between what I teach and my research project on pedagogy is how do we ensure that students who are taking online courses, which they will once the pandemic is over, and they have been taking courses before the pandemic erupted in an online format. How do we provide them the same kind of access to experiential learning that are much more hands-on, that really help students to engage with these more difficult theoretical concepts, as well as explore some practical challenges. So, for instance, I used experiential learning activities that teach students how to do a conflict assessment. And it's actually based on my own experiences doing a conflict assessment some years ago in Liberia, where inadvertently, because my team split into 4 independent sub-teams, the way we constructed the conflict within each team in this particular community was quite different. And it lends itself, therefore, to thinking about the challenges of doing data collection, some ethical implications of it that might emerge. And so that's been really a real opportunity, in a sense, of being forced to shift everything online to really think about how to do these activities and simulations in a virtual format.
Thank you very much. I finally perfected the I finally perfected the
Hmm.
I think we might have lost Bassam.
I think we may have.
If we didn't, or even if I did lose him, I might just go ahead and answer that question. Oh, there he is.
can you, okay, I'm sorry. So you did not hear anything? You
No,
know,
you were cut out.
you know what is the funniest thing is that or the oddest thing is that I was actually saying when I was speaking that we finally figured out the mute button issue on this software, and it actually wasn't true. I think I was in preview mode. I apologize. I was saying that this is something that was extremely insightful, Agnieszka, and I actually take a lot of these teaching insights from my colleagues as we do these interviews and conversations, and I try to apply them in my own course. So thank you very much. And then I was asking Ben to move forward, and then I heard that you guys were not hearing me. So let's move to
Yes.
Ben. I apologize for this. Okay.
No worries. Thank you, Bassam. So most of my teaching, at least over the past few years, has been in our graduate folklore program. So I teach our kind of our graduate introduction to folklore course. I standardly teach our kind of core course in folklore theory. I've also taught a course on personal narrative, folklore and the supernatural course. You know, one course that's of particular interest to Middle East and Islamic studies is that I've taught a course on folklore in the Middle East and Central Asia, and I hope to teach that again in the not so distant future. In terms of kind of my pedagogy and my approaches, I think one of the big challenges in teaching a folklore class, especially to undergraduates, is surmounting what we call the triviality barrier, right? That's the idea that most people have that folklore is fun, it's cute, it's scary, it's interesting, it's bawdy, it's dirty. I don't know, it's any of these things,
Mhm.
but is it worthy of our serious attention? Like people often have the idea, especially on the outside, right, that folklore we might call epiphenomenal, right? It's merely a reflection of something else that we might better access via other means. So I spend a lot of time with our students thinking about how folk practices, how expressive culture, how kind of everyday cultural creativity is constitutive of our social worlds, right? It's not just reflective of those things. And one of the kind of key ways that I do that, and this kind of segues into your second question, Bassam, about how the pandemic and movements for racial justice have affected my teaching. For example, in my graduate introduction folklore class last year when I taught it, we talked a lot about the folklore of the moment, right? So we have a global pandemic going on. There's all sorts of rumors about the pandemic, about vaccines. There's all sorts of what we might call urban legends, right? About its origins of the disease, of who's making the vaccine, all of those sorts of things. So we talked about those legends and rumors, conspiracy theories, right? As a way to think about folklore themes. Similarly, when we talked about material culture in my class this past fall, we kind of foregrounded the expressive culture of the Black Lives Matter movement rather. We talked about protest culture. We talked about the kind of material ways, the embodied ways, right? That last summer in particular, the movements in Washington D.C. Used. We talked about those in my classes, and then finally last year, in terms of thinking about kind of the ways that my teaching is engaging the present, is we talked about memes. We talked about kind of at that point, President Trump's, right before the election, President Trump's use of social media, jokes, and other forms of expressive culture as they exist on the internet, on Twitter, and things like that. And those are ways to kind of surmount that triviality barrier, I guess, that I mentioned just a second ago. And I guess the only other thing I would say in terms of my teaching, is that I emphasize ethnographic writing, right? So folklore isn't just about kind of this interpretive move that I've just talked about. It's also about the documentation one. It's also about the collaborating with groups, communities, to document their culture, right? And we use ethnographic methods to do that. So that's another kind of key component of what my classes entail. I think that's about it, Bassam.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. This is also very interesting, and I I'm sort of moved to. Okay, you can hear me now, I'm hoping.
Yes.
Excellent. So this is really insightful as well, and actually moved to trying to work with our program faculty to put together a workshop on pedagogy and teaching within George Mason University, which is something that we sometimes do beyond George Mason,
Mhm.
and that is a practice that we follow at the Middle East Studies pedagogy initiative, but it usually is broader, like within national and
Mhm.
international circles. But I really feel that it would be wonderful to focus in on the George Mason community, given that our community is actually quite diverse and not unique, but it has its own a special flavor and presence, the George Mason student body. So I would love to have this conversation further with uh, other faculty as well in the context of a workshop. Um, Before I let you go, and I kind of don't want to let you go because I'd like to talk more, I would like to ask you if you can share with us any kind of any sort of activities or events that you are involved in or would like to be involved in, not least as a function of the new environment that we have entered to, whether it is about gender equality,
Mhm.
questions of uh, 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 even questions of harassment in the workplace, or matters of race and various issues related to race. We just had a workshop on racial capitalism
Mhm.
and so on. So, if you have anything to share with us that you are involved in outside the classroom or would like to be involved in, or things that you
Mhm.
plan to bring to the classroom or to George Mason, that would be great. And I'll start with Agnieszka.
It's an interesting question, especially right since we're living in this very peculiar moment. So one of the things that I certainly have brought into the classroom has been my involvement with the social justice, racial justice movement over the last year and a half. It, it was actually in many ways an opportunity to also get to know a lot of young people who have become incredibly passionately involved and advocate for racial justice. Which, in the midst of this difficult year and a half, has been the sort of one silver lining is seeing this incredible commitment of young people to working to change the structural violence, the structural inequalities in this country and internationally as well. So that's been something that I certainly hope to continue being involved in and to continue bringing it into the classroom. I'm also involved in peace building field. Member of the board of Safer World USA, which is a branch, U.S. branch of Safer World, which is based in its headquarters are in the UK, but it has peace building programs across the globe. And that has been really important to me as well, and really informs what I do in the classroom because I collaborate with the practitioners who work for Safer World and get insights about processes of peace building and conflict resolution in a variety of countries across the globe, including actually Tajikistan was one of the places where the Safer World has its programming. Um, so I hope there will be more opportunities at George Mason to engage with these issues of racial justice or gender discrimination and so on. One of the things that I was doing before the pandemic was working again with students who take the foundations course, the introductory course to peace and conflict studies when they enter our master's program. And this is actually a bigger project that is directed by Patricia Molden, who is a faculty member at the Carter School, called Dialogue and Difference. And that's another space where I think there's a lot of opportunities to bring the community, Mason community, together to address some of these very difficult issues, right? So one of the events that my students and I organized a couple of years ago was Me Too movement, gone too far, not far enough. And it generated a lot of really interesting, deep discussions around issues connected to the Me Too movement. So I hope that we can use that platform once we are able to meet in person so that these conversations can happen.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Very quickly before I move to Ben and before we close, have you noticed? You don't have to. You can just pass. But have you noticed since the emergence of these movements, which have actually had resonance all over the world, as you have seen,
Absolutely. Yeah.
have you noticed a change in our own student body in the classroom? Has there been, in your experience, more awareness, more readiness, and sometimes, frankly, more uh, vigor or I don't want to say aggression, but have you noticed a difference in terms of like sort of the intellectual mobilization of our student body since?
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I think students who come to the Carter School are already sort of self-selected in the sense that they do care about issues of social justice and peace building. But I have seen, I think, the commitment to these issues has become much more passionate. Students have been, I think, much more willing to engage in really difficult conversations around race. Um, I think in many ways, my sense was that in many ways, the fact that all of a sudden everybody was in virtual space and that a lot of the discussions, the courses I was teaching were asynchronous. So all our discussions were happening on the discussion boards in Blackboard. My sense was that a lot more students were willing to engage with these very difficult conversations because they had more time to craft what they wanted to say. And so in some ways, the conversations became much more intimate, much more powerful. People were willing to really not just display their passion and care about these subjects, but were willing to open themselves up and show their vulnerabilities in ways that I think sometimes was more difficult to do in an in-person context where your responses need to come up right away, right? You don't have time to think about how you want to engage with a particular difficult set of conversations. So I've definitely seen a change and a greater willingness to really grapple with these issues.
Thank you. That's actually good to hear, and because I do think that the boat, if you will, needed to be rocked a little bit because we
Mm-hmm.
get complacent sometimes, even if unintentionally, and even if we are theoretically active and thinking and pursuing matters of social justice. I think in practice, what we have seen out there in the world has actually moved us to maybe have our ideas comport more with the reality in practice. So that's great to hear. Ben, have you noticed that shift at all in your classes? Given that you both teach, maybe you have overlaps, but you also teach different classes and different student bodies.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Bassam. One thing that Mason's folklore faculty do is we edit the Journal of American Folklore, and the Journal of American
Mm-hmm.
Folklore is the flagship journal of the American Folklore Society. It's the most widely read folklore journal in the U.S. And my Mason colleagues and I, one of our initiatives when we took this on last year, was to move the journal towards greater decolonial justice. Now, of course, folklore studies is a colonial discipline, right? It's a discipline that's been deeply implicated in nationalism. The Journal of American Folklore has been around since 1888. So there's a lot of history that we can go back and talk about. And what we've done is we have completely revamped the editorial board to prioritize decolonial justice. We've completely prioritized thinking about incorporating scholars who are writing more from the global South than the current crop of scholars that we have. And we've even been working on initiatives to de-emphasize the American in our title, the Journal of American Folklore, that we are a global quarterly of folklore published by the American Folklore Society. So that these kind of the things that when you ask the question about what's going on, the thing that immediately comes to my mind is that it's not just in our classrooms, it's not just in our research, but it's also in a lot of the other things that we're doing in our scholarship, that we're asking those same sorts of questions.
Thank you, Ben. This is yet another insightful answer. I'm I'm always moved the more I speak with our faculty, and so far we've had 6 people or join our podcast, and we have another 7 today. So by the end of the day, I think I'll start planning this workshop. So thank you again. What I would like to do actually is let you know that as we are speaking right now, the next 2 interviewees or the next 2 faculty members are beginning to call because they are on time for the 3 o'clock. So this is really exciting. I actually had this idea of bringing them on now in order to, sort of see if we could have a 4-way discussion before 3 p.m. But then these won't be separate videos. So that's the only catch. In all cases, I wanted to thank you profusely, both of you, for coming on and for sharing your ideas and for being so gracious in joining us on relatively short notice and at a time when we're supposed to leave you alone or you're supposed to be left alone to an extent. I'm not sure if you're teaching in the summer. So I thank you very much. We will be releasing these videos in on our website, as well as on a dedicated website for the Middle East and Islamic Studies program. If for any reason technically we're not able to be dynamic with university websites, because university websites are usually slow to act and change and kind of conform to the developments out in the world sometimes. So please join us for the remainder of the podcasts today. Next, I'm speaking with Amal Amiri and Nathaniel Greenberg, and after that I'm speaking with Professor Ahmed Tiliyoglu. I just butchered his name. And after that with Eric McGlinchey and Hatem Al-Hibri. And tomorrow, I hope, with others. So thank you very much. If there are any last words, share them. If not, I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you, Bassam.
for inviting us. Thanks, Bassam.
Thank you. I hope to see you soon. Salam.
Okay.
Actually,
Bye-bye.
hang on a second. Hang on 1 second. Can you hang on 1 second?
Mhm.
I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna totally try this. Amal, I'm totally doing this for just at least a little bit. Amal, can you hear me? You're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, you know what? We're just gonna have to sign off, and I'll start with them just so that because we're gonna
Sounds
have to
good.
cut off anyway, so we
Great.
have 2 different videos, so people don't click and then have a 6-hour podcast to watch.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful
Thank
summer.
you.
Salam.
See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.